said, my name's Terry and I work with the National Archives in Victoria here in Melbourne. Today I'm going to start off by looking at some ways of searching our website for the records that you're interested in. I strongly suspect that some of you are probably quite experienced at doing that already, but some of you may not be, so I'm just going to run through a few different ways of searching for records that you're looking for. And then we're going to look at a particular series of records that we hold here in Melbourne that was developed by the Department of the Army during the Second World War, keeping records of properties that were hired for military use. Okay. I called my talk today Airfields to Hospitals. Looking through those records, a lot of properties were acquired during the war for all sorts of administrative and military purposes, and we're going to look at 3 of those records that were used for different purposes this afternoon. This particular map that you see on the screen at the moment is from a file about land that was hired around the village of Logan in Queensland. And that land was used for Camp Cable, which was a military camp, recreational camp and training camp, mostly used for US forces. This particular series, I think, could be of interest to family historians, particularly if your ancestors had any property that was hired during the Second World War. These files can often include a very detailed report about the property, listing what the condition of the property was, what buildings were on it, who the owners were, who the occupants were. And they also often contain letters written by the property owners. But this series could also be of interest to local historians who were looking at what happened in their area during the Second World War. Okay, so who is the National Archives? For those of you, probably a lot of you already know, but we are the custodian of records created, kept or received by the Commonwealth Government. And our collection consists of over 40 million different items. These record the Australian government's activities since Federation in 1901. We do have some records that we inherited from prior to 1901, but mostly our records commence from 1901 at Federation. A lot of our records are files of documents, but we also hold posters, plans, films, sound recordings, videotapes, increasingly these days digital records, and lots of photographs. And these are records that have been deemed to be worthy of being kept permanently for the record. This collection is really valuable because it holds a great deal of what explains us as a nation, how we came to be the Australia we are today, both culturally, politically, and in all sorts of other ways. The best place to start if you want to start looking for records and search our collection is to go to our website. You'll find us at www.naa.gov.au. And if you click on Search the Collection, you will arrive at this page. You can go straight to Record Search, which is where you start looking for records, but this page also offers you some other options. You can request a proof of arrival if that's what you're particularly interested in. You can be guided through looking for service dossiers, if that's what you're also. And also on just here, there's a link that helps you to ask us a question. So if you need to ask a question or find a particular record, you can click on that link and you'll be guided through sending in a question, and then a reference officer will do what they can to help you with that particular inquiry. The easiest place to start searching our collection is with a basic search. In here you can enter, oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay. That, okay. You can enter a keyword, which can be a name or the subject you're looking for, or also a date range. It's usually best to start searching quite wide, so just a name first. If you get too many results, you can always refine your search, but if you try starting to put too much information in to start off with, particularly with date ranges, you'll find that some records you're looking for won't come up because the date range that you've put in doesn't exactly match what's attached to the record. So start fairly broad and narrow down if you get too many inquiries. This particular search, looks at item level. As I said earlier, we have over 40 million records in our collection, and at the moment about 35% of those are actually described at item level. So if you're searching for something in particular and you use this type of search and it doesn't come up with anything or doesn't find exactly what you're looking for, it doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't got it. It could quite possibly mean that it's just not yet been indexed at the item level, and so we would need to go looking at finding other methods to locate that item. And to do that, you would need to do an advanced search, and that to do an advanced search, you would first come to this page. The various levels you can use to search those, we've already... I'll have to stop doing that. We've already talked about the item level. You can search at series level, which is the series is a group of records that were created on the same subject or about the same time or by the same organisation. Agencies usually refers to the government department or agency that actually created the record. And Commonwealth persons are records created and collected by significant people in the Commonwealth, usually Prime Ministers, Governors General, or other senior politicians of the time. If you really don't know where to start, you can click on Functions. And that provides you with an A to Z. And you click on the letter of the subject you're interested in, and it gives you some things to look at. Here, because our subject is land today, I clicked on L, and that gives us land, land claims, land councils, land rights, land transport, and land use. I'm clicking on, I think I clicked on land for this, I can't quite remember, to be honest. It gives us some departments that have records that have been responsible for records that had land in their titles. This gives you the agency title and a date range. That is the date range that that particular agency had control of the records. It's not the date range of the records themselves. So don't be put off if you see they're all about in the 2000s. There will be records in the series that come before that. And on the very far right-hand column, I keep doing you'll see you can click on the series that those departments were responsible for. The other option is to go straight to agencies. If you're looking for a person in particular, a good place to start is to think about where they may have interacted with the federal government. And after that, once you've thought about that, what government department is that likely to have been that they were dealing with? Here I clicked on the agency search and I've typed in land and property, and here I've selected any words. You can, in that drop-down box, you can have any words or all words. If you leave it at all words, it will look for a phrase, so it would look for titles that had land and property in them. If you change it to any words, it looks for either land or property. And I've also clicked on this little box here. If you click that little box, then the system goes and searches for in the notes attached to the items as well as just the titles. Most items in our record search have notes attached which explain what they are, the history, how they're controlled. And this, if you click that box, the system will go and search those notes as well as just the title. Also here, just to reduce the number of answers, I've restricted it to Victoria. That may not be suitable for your search because the records can be held in different places around the country, but this just restricted the number for my purposes. and we get a list of 162 agencies with records referring to land or property. One of those is the one at the bottom here, which is the hiring section of the Department of the Interior, and that is the section that had control of the records that we're going to look at, so say a little bit later. If we look at the series search, we click on that button, series, and again we can put in titles. If you put in property, you will find 62 series that come up, held in Melbourne. Clicked on Melbourne here. That have property in the title. If you could put in land, you'll find 55 series. You may notice here, you'll notice in this right column here, there are series titles, but no items listed next to it. That doesn't mean that it's an empty series. It just means that the series exists, we have it in our possession, but we haven't actually indexed any of the items as yet. So if that's a series that you really think might hold something that you are interested in, then you have two options. The first one is to come and see us in the reading room at North Melbourne, and the reading room officer will help you to use our search and finding aids to find exactly what you're looking for. Or you can go back to that button that I pointed out, that link that I pointed out earlier, which is Ask Us a Question. Provide us with as much detail as you know about what you're looking for and the particular series you're interested in, and the reference officer can find out the information for you. The particular series that we're going to look at this afternoon is this one, Property Hiring Files, B985. This series of property hiring files is actually controlled by the Department of the Interior Hiring Section. The files were actually inherited from the Army Hiring Service in 1946, which used to operate out of the Army Central Office. A file in this collection exists for every property that was hired under the National Security General Regulations in 1939. And these files contain papers such as the present and proposed use of the land, the present owners and occupiers, the location of the land. It also includes descriptions of property or assets on the land, and all correspondence around claims for compensation and the dehiring process. As I said, the Department of the Interior inherited these records in 1946. Prior to that, the system was controlled by the Army Hiring Service, and they used to receive applications from the armed services saying which property they wanted to hire, go out and negotiate the hire of the property, and then inform the actual armed forces when the negotiation had been hired, what the date of the occupation was to be, and what the cost was to be, or what the compensation charge was. Then, from then on, the relevant armed force would be responsible for maintaining the property and paying the compensation. In August 1946, this was transferred to the Department of the Interior, and they became responsible for all the dehiring processes. This was obviously after the war. Those properties were beginning to be dehired, and the Department of the Interior took over that responsibility. When these records came into the care of the Department of the Interior, they were all combined from all the different states and top numbered. So our control symbols will first have an alpha indicator stating what state they were from. So N for Northern Territory, NT for Northern Territory, M for New South Wales, V for Victoria, T for Tasmania, etc. The states were then all given a primary number. So the smaller states where the hirings were fewer just had one number. South Australia had 11, Tasmania 10, Western Australia 13, etc. Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, and New South Wales, where the hirings were more common, were given 3 numbers with an alpha spread. So Victoria had 1 to 3, 1 being A to G, 2 being H to L, and 3 being M to Z. New South Wales had 4 to 6, and Queensland 7 to 9. So, for example, N/4/248 is a file titled Bondi Hotel Astra, and yes, N is for New South Wales. The 4 represents the Bondi, which is the A to G, and the 248 is the actual number of the file. General files and administration files in this series got the number 14, and they contain all sorts of policy, delegations, procedures, correspondence. So here we have another listing. This one's in Victoria. It's got a V. The number 1 because it's in Dandenong, and the file number is 40. And the first, one of the records we find in this file is a letter. This letter is dated the 9th of March. It's addressed to a Mrs. Peacock, who was the owner of the property, and she leased this property to 2 tenants, a Mr. Baxter and a Mr. Hamilton. And this letter informs Mrs. Peacock that the Department of the Army is acquiring her land, 113 acres, dated back to the 1st of March, and that she will be paid £84 a year in compensation for the use of her land. Later on in the file, there's a complaint recorded suggesting that she was given no warning about this. The first she heard about it was when one of her tenants complained that he'd been told to quit the land because the army was taking it over. 2 days after that letter was written, Mrs. Peacock wrote this letter to a Captain Staton, requesting that her tenants still be allowed to put his cows on the property for a few hours a day. You can actually see from this little message that's written on the top here, the answer was no. So he had to put his cows somewhere else. I'm not sure where they went, but they didn't go on this property for a little while after that. Okay. Now this is actually the plan of the land. You can see this is Wellington Road, this is Stud Road, so this is on the corner of Wellington and Stud Road in Dandenong. Lots 5 and 6, these were actually eventually compulsorily purchased by the Department of the Army. Land was usually compulsorily purchased rather than being hired if they planned to have it for an extended period of time. If they were planning to do considerable developments on it, which would have increased its value, or conversely, if what was going to happen and it was going to considerably decrease its value, so that they would have had to pay a significant compensation when the land was returned to the landowner. This particular block was originally used as an army training camp, but then it became the Rowville Prisoner of War Camp. And this prisoner of war camp was used to house Italian prisoners of war who were employed in some of the military establishments around Victoria, such as the Fisherman's Bend Salvage Depot and the engineering works at Oakley. And it was also used as a transit camp for housing prisoners of war who were working on farms. So when they were between assignments, they would be housed here until they moved on to their next location. It wasn't actually a locked camp. There were no fences around it, but the rules were that the inmates, the people living there, were not allowed outside the boundaries of the camp after 6 o'clock at night. Lot 7, which is this area here, was actually returned to Mrs. Peacock in August 1943. And the rest of the file is actually full of correspondence about compensation claims for damage that was done during the hire, and also for issues of the ongoing presence of the camp just next door. One of the main complaints, unfortunately, seems to be that there was sewage overflowing from the camp onto the pasture land. Mrs. Peacock's tenant wasn't very happy about this. He said it was ruining his pasture. The military inspector that was actually sent out to investigate this problem said that the cattle actually seemed to prefer to be grazing on that particular area, and that it was in the driest months, it was actually providing irrigation and improving the land. They never actually agreed on any compensation for that particular problem, but eventually, with the aid of a prisoner of war labour, they did build or dig a trench. Sadly, unfortunately, this didn't really please Mr. Hamilton anymore because it was an unfenced open ditch, and he said that was stagnant and was a danger to his cattle, so it didn't really help the situation. Anyway, just as a matter of interest, I thought we could have a look, but courtesy of Google Maps, we have a look at what that particular area looks like today. This seems to be some sort of electrical installation, and if we go back to that map, there is an electrical commission easement going across the property there. And this area has been built on. I'm not sure how the people who live there would feel if they knew that back in the 1940s the land their house is on was being soaked with sewage. Maybe it makes the roses grow better. Don't know. Okay, if we go back to our record search again, I said that these records might be interesting to family historians. Where a particular piece of land was being hired from a private landowner, that landowner's name is in the title of the document. So on this page here, we've got Morris Brothers, and we've got a Dr. R. Merton and an A.J. Staunton, I think. So they were obviously landowners. But they might also be interesting to local historians. Because the records are actually controlled by location, then the town or area name is in the title of the file. So here I typed in Werribee, and I got 8 records with Werribee in the title. And one of those records is for the property known as Werribee Manor, which was actually originally the family homestead of the Chirnside family. The first document, one of the early documents anyway, that you see in this record is the letter from the RAF group captain requesting that the Army Hiring Service acquire this particular property. He states that he doesn't need the whole land that the property is on, just the house and the surrounding land. And we find out later in the file that this property is actually going to be used for an RAF convalescent depot. This is one of the documents that's found in most of these records. It's probably one of the most interesting. It's actually the property report. When they were requested to acquire a property, someone was sent out to do a property report, and it includes information about the ownership of the land, the location, the nature and condition of the land and any buildings or assets that are on it, and also the value of the land. This particular property, as I said, it was originally the family homestead of the Chirnside family, built in the 1895, 1896. The Chirnside family actually sold it in 1920, and by the Second World War, it had found its way into the hands of the Hayes family. Although this particular document says its owners are the Doughter Gatter Park Pty Limited. It's described as a 2-storey brick dwelling with 26 rooms, 10 on the ground floor, 16 on the upper floor, in 104 acres, and the value of the property at that time was £12,000. It also records that the Hayes family are not at all happy about being required to vacate their home and were worried about being able to find suitable accommodation, and they asked if they could continue to use the billiard room as storage. The wing commander of the RAF, I'm afraid, said no, they needed the whole building, so yet again the answer was no. I haven't actually found any photographs in any of this series, But I did manage to find this photograph on the Werribee, on the Wyndham Historical Society webpage. So this was the actual house that we're talking about. And this is the plan of the land that they were planning to take, they were taking over. Not a lot on it at that time. This is the house, there are stables, this is the river, and the rest was farmland. Again, courtesy of Google Maps, this is what that particular area of land looks like today. Not a lot of space for farming, and no sign of the house anymore because that actually burnt down in 1966. They do actually believe, however, that some of the mature trees, particularly the standing of elms that are along Werribee River, are actually remnants of the old manor gardens. Now, this is another document that you'll find in any of the records where a building was being taken over, and this is an inventory of the building's contents. So it lists everything, all the household equipment and furniture, whatever was being left behind. This particular one lists some well-worn carpets, a very ornamental sideboard, and some faded curtains. And this is the actual agreement that was signed. It's called a compensation agreement. It was actually signed in 1943, but backdated to June 1942. And it lists the compensation for the hire of a 28-6-room building, plus stables, plus 12 acres of land, was going to be £43, 4 shillings and twopence a month. And also the address is listed as the Shire of Manbury in the county of Grant. Just a matter of interest. The property was actually dehired in March 1945, but the records go on right until 1948 with correspondence and minutes and claims for compensation about damage that was done to the property during the hire. They eventually agreed on a compensation amount of £1,135, 2 shillings and 5 pence. Very exact records we have in our collection. If we move on now to another record, this is actually in the same area and land that was probably also part of the Churnside estate at some point in the past. This is for 2 much smaller pieces of land, which were acquired for beacons for the Point Cook Air Base. The red one is the outer beacon and the blue one, the inner beacon. These were actually owned by 2 separate landlords, Mr. And they actually were not at all unhappy, didn't seem to be at all unhappy about their land being used for the war effort. In fact, neither of them actually requested any compensation for use of the land. Relations did get a little bit more fraught, however, with the Mr. Barber, who owned the land closest to the property. You can see from this plan here and down here, there's this brown line. This was the road to the beacon, and it actually went parallel to the fence of the airbase and joined up with another road here. The next record in the file is a letter written by the Assistant Director of Hirings suggesting that the road be moved. The reason for this change of plan was because the people from the airbase were taking a shortcut. Instead of going to the road, they had cut a hole in the fence and were going straight to the beacon, which was fine for them, except a hole big enough in a fence for a man to crawl through is also big enough for a sheep to get through. And the sheep were obviously looking through the fence at this relatively unnibbled grass on the airfield and deciding they'd probably like to have a wander over there, so they were finding their way into the airfield. Unfortunately, once they got onto the airfield, they were considered a danger to the planes taking off and landing and were being shot. This didn't make the landowner, Mr. Barber, very happy. So he'd obviously complained, and this was the change of plan. They moved the road. It was to be a fenced road direct to the beacon so the sheep could graze all around it without being tempted to stray onto the airfield. Okay. We go back to our record search, just another little tweak, as you may or may not already know. If you were interested in looking at just digital records that have already been digitized in a series, if you tick this little box down here, it will show you just the digital records. Now, that particular record you're looking at may not be the one you're interested in, but if you're wondering about whether or not this particular record is going to help you, if you found something that you think might be interesting, but you don't know exactly what sort of information's in it, sometimes it's worthwhile looking at one of these digital records, because records in series quite often contain very similar sorts of information. So you can see what's in the records that have already been digitized, and that might help you decide whether or not it's worthwhile requesting a record that you might be interested in. And this is the actual list of records that have been digitized in this series that we've been looking at, which is B985. If you do find that you want to look at a record that hasn't been digitized, you've actually got two options. You can come to the reading room at North Melbourne. We'd be very happy to see you up there. We do actually prefer a 48-hour notice for that. And the best way to let us know about that is to go to this page. You get to this page by clicking on that Ask Us a Question button that I pointed out earlier. And if you click on Advanced Request for Records, tell us what records you want to look at and when you want to come, we can have them ready for you in the reading room. When you come to the reading room, you are very welcome to bring a camera, iPod, phone, whatever you want to use to take photographs of the records and make your own copy. That's very, very much encourage people to do that. It is possible, however, if you prefer, and there is a charge for this service, to request a copy. To do that, you would go to the record that you're interested in and click on Request a Copy. That will walk you through the process of actually ordering a copy online. You may already be aware that all the records that we hold first have to go through a process of access examination before they can be released to the public. You'll see on this one it says access status and open. That means that process has already happened for this record and it can be made available in the reading room, or copies can be made available immediately. If the record you're looking at has not yet examined in that space, that means that this particular record hasn't gone through that process yet, and it would need to go through that process before you can actually view it either in the reading room or request a copy of it. Again, if you click on that Request a Copy button, it will point you in the direction you need to go to be able to request that an item be access examined. And when the items are available, we will be very happy to see you. We are located at the Victorian Archives Centre, which is at 99 Shield Street, Melbourne, and the National Archives Reading Room is open Wednesday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Thank you very much for your attention. Has anybody got any questions?